Hello, I'm Nigel Walley from Decipher, and this is Decipher's presentation on addressable TV. This presentation is intended as some pre-work for the session we're doing live on Thursday the 16th with Screenforce in Holland. So a big thank you for the invitation to do this with everyone. I'm going to just quickly explain the bigger context for these kind of presentations, then I'll explain what's in this video. And you can choose whether to watch all of it before the session on Thursday or whether to watch bits of it and come back to it later. Addressable TV is one of those subjects that is very popular at the moment in conferences and white papers, etc. And we're very conscious that when we listen to people speaking and when we read white papers, that people use lots of jargon, very often from the American market, which seems odd to us. People describe ideas in words that seem to conflict with other ideas with people on the stage. And it seems to be an area where the two worlds of internet advertising and television advertising are crashing together in a way that is at the moment uncomfortable and unresolved. So our aim with these videos is to begin a debate in the industry about the details of addressable TV and get people really thinking about what's the correct terminology, what's the correct technology, and how addressable TV fits into the broader campaign landscape. So with these videos, we are looking to do a number of things. We are looking to establish the landscape for the market, get people talking about how addressable technologies fit into the broader story. We want people to critically appraise the presentations from suppliers. We hear people from supplier companies say things sometimes, and we want people to push back and say, is that true? Tell me more details. Can you really do that? So part of the rationale here is to get people to start asking difficult questions. We want people to be able to identify the different players. We hear at conferences lots of companies from different parts of the value chain talking about the fact that they can do some form of addressability. And we want to understand how the different players, how platforms can deliver addressability and why that's different to the way broadcasters can deliver addressability and why that's different to how apps can deliver addressable TV or addressable video. So we need people to kind of be able to pick apart the industry into different players. We want them to kind of review and critically discuss the propositions, really be able to kind of pick the pieces of it, and also encourage participation in the debate. We want everybody in our industry to be driving the debate around addressable TV, because we feel at the moment a lot of the concepts and a lot of the ideas are being pushed by a small number of technology companies, and we really need to widen out the debate. So that's why we're doing these sessions. This video is an hour and a half long, so you may not choose to watch all of it before the session on Thursday. But let me just explain what's in it. We've broken it down into 3 parts, and you can either choose to watch 1, 2, or all of them. And if you look underneath the video on the YouTube data section, you'll see the times you might want to jump to, depending on which bits you want to look at. So in the first section, we're talking about the context of addressability, and we look at some of the big ideas for how addressable TV can be defined and how it fits into the current landscape for television advertising. In the middle section, we talk about the mechanisms used, the technology. Now, we're not a technology consultancy, but we recognize that if we all in the marketing industry want to talk about addressable TV, we do all need to raise our level of our technological understanding, just kind of one level up. And so this is our summary of all the conversations we've had with the technology providers, and we've kind of pulled apart the complex details and just summarized what we think marketing people need to know. And then in the final third of the presentation, we're going to look at some of the formats for addressable TV. And what we've done is look at lots of case studies and lots of activity and broken it down into 6 types of campaign. So we can begin to talk about the type of campaign you might want to run with addressable TV. So they're the 3 sections of this video. On Thursday, with the Screenforce people, we will be doing the next stage. We're going to pick apart some of the real players and look at who's doing what and who's doing interesting things around the market. So that's the video. Let's get into it. let's get into the context for addressability. And we're going to go into the slides. We think it's important, before delving into the real details of this debate, of just laying down some ground rules. We're very conscious that often when you talk about television advertising, and in particular the evolution of advertising, you end up with these polarized debates between television and digital. And I put digital in inverted commas there because we're not keen on the phrase. And you'll see as we go through this presentation that we don't actually like the word digital. We find it unhelpful because everything we're going to talk about is digital, whether it's television or internet. And what you'll see is that we're making the case that the television landscape is incredibly well converged. So the idea that there is a distinction between two separate camps in television is long gone. So we don't like this setup you very often see around television advertising. We much prefer to think about the difference between what we call the audience context for television and the user context for television. Now, this is a very tangible thing, and particularly from the perspective of television advertising, it has material impact on the way advertising can be targeted, can be delivered, and can be measured. Quite clearly, in the last 10 years, a new form of television consumption has arrived on personal devices, very often that we hold in our hands. And these devices, are user devices. And it's very different from the traditional forms of TV where it was common to sit around as a group. And so we like to discuss the difference between audience and user media and avoid phrases like television and digital. And you'll see that as we go through. But I just want to just touch on these two worlds briefly. You'll see a few times through this debate that we set up this comparison with television over on the left and the internet over on the right. And if we look at the nature of television in these two separate worlds for the moment, the user world characterized by traditional television the user world characterized by the internet, and traditional television characterized by audiences and broadcast. If we compare the worlds, clearly, as I mentioned, television is used to dealing with audiences, not users. Now, an audience isn't just the cumulative sum of a group of users. The idea of an individual user comes with some very different characteristics from an advertising point of view than the idea of an audience. It can be assumed for most TV systems we're now dealing with that the audience isn't logged in to large shared audiences. There may be, on the newer systems, a single account owner's name behind the system, but from an audience point of view, we don't know who's in the room. Whereas when we're dealing with television viewed through personal devices like phones and tablets, it's reasonable to assume that people will be logged into whichever app and service and device they're using. Non-interactive. So when we look at the way television audiences play with interactive formats on the big screen, it was a piece of learning very early on, 10 years ago, that interactivity is not great on large shared screens. And so the newer ad formats that we're seeing discussed tend not to come out with interactivity on the big screen. Whereas we're still seeing a number of broadcasters around Europe developing and pushing out new interactive formats that play out on personal devices. And so there is a much greater preponderance towards interactivity on individual user devices around television than there is up on the big screen. Also on the big screen, because of the audience nature, because we don't know who's in the room, we still require audience measurement as opposed to web user measurement. And so we're still believers in the central role of the TAM organizations around Europe, the audience measurement industry. And we believe that they provide a qualitative data set, which is hugely important still and has a role in a combined media data set that we'll talk about later on. Whereas obviously, if you're watching television on a phone or a tablet or a personal device of some form, it's much more likely that some form of web measurement can be used and will actually work. And then finally, from a commercial point of view, when we look at advertising formats in particular, we are still seeing around Europe the idea that traditional television on the big screen still falls within the traditional agency structure, the traditional deal structure we're seeing in place, and a much greater percentage of advertising that's delivered through personal devices over the web or to social media around TV is what we would call out of deal. So there is a commercial difference still in the way that brands and their agencies deal with web video versus television. And all of those 5 points really kind of flag up why culturally there's still a significant difference between those two worlds. And it's important when we talk about advertising in particular, much more than content on its own, when we talk about advertising, that we bear all of those things in mind. The next thing is the nature of the opportunity. This chart on the left is produced by ThinkBox in the UK, and it's a breakdown of all video consumed across a day by the average adult. There are versions which break down individual segments like youth into more detail, but this breaks down everything into an average of about 4 hours and 42 minutes. We take the analysis slightly further, and we add in a split between our two worlds, our audience world and our user world. And you can see that there's still some significant differences in the nature of the content consumed by devices, and also by the volume. So it's not surprising that video consumption, which differs from overall web obviously, but video consumption is still significantly higher on the larger screens, even after 10 years of shift from big screen viewing down to small screen viewing. We would also flag up that linear broadcast television still makes up about half of total viewing across the day. So if you look at the main block, 49.5%, and recorded is actually 11%. And so 50 to 60% of television is either live broadcast or recorded off live. And we have to focus on that as the biggest opportunity for advertisers. When we look at viewing on the small screens, we have to reflect that there's a very high weighting towards SVOD. And so when we consider the shift to watching on demand and watching on personal devices, we have to flag up that a lot of that shift is for content formats that don't have advertising in the mix. So SVOD's domination of small screen is hugely important, as is YouTube. When we look at video, what's happening down on the individual devices, a large amount of it is YouTube related video, which comes with its own very specific ad targeting mechanisms. But finally, the big thing we want to flag up, and we've just started measuring in the last year, is actually a shift back up onto the big screen. So that right hand of the 3 bars has grown up over the last 10 years as people have taken up individual devices. But the last few years, we've seen the launch of SVOD apps like Netflix and like Amazon Prime and Disney Plus, etc. We've seen them launching on set-top boxes and on televisions up on the big screen. And so we're beginning to see a shift of viewing of those formats back up onto large screen TV. So we wouldn't be surprised in 5 years' time to see the left hand of the pair of these bar charts to have grown again, to have turned the trend around and grown back up. And it's for that reason, the resilience of large screen viewing, that we still think that the significant opportunity is there. The addressable TV opportunity is really, the weighting of it is onto the big screen, it's onto linear and broadcast and recorded and on demand. We have to reflect, of course, that part of this shift comes from the cost of screens. In the 15 years that we've been looking at flat screen televisions, a large 65-inch flat screen that we would bring into our test studios has gone down from 3,000, 4,000 euro down to 300 or 400. So an incredible reduction in the price of flat screen televisions. And that means that the number of units out there that are owned in the average audience has skyrocketed. And because of that, it's not uncommon to find flat screen televisions in many rooms around the house, and people are shifting their viewing from smaller devices back up onto the big screen because of that. So you'll see in this presentation that we focus a lot on linear and on broadcast and on the opportunities to deliver addressable formats up onto what we would consider mainstream traditional television screens. It seems like an odd question to ask at this point. What is television? But it's one of those areas of context that we think it's worth just exploring again, because the nature of television delivery has a huge impact on the nature of the addressable TV campaigns that can be delivered. And so I just want to lay out for you how we look at the TV landscape, the content in which addressable TV campaigns can be delivered. So once again, I'm going to divide the screen between television over on the left and point out that obviously for a long time, television was only made up of broadcast linear television channels with programs, ads, programs, and ads. You know, it was the traditional format. 20 years ago, we started to get digital recordings with personal video recorders, PVRs. Some people call them DVRs, but the idea that you could record content not on a VCR tape, but in digital form in a set-top box. We like to flag that up because there are a number of advertising platforms who are beginning to talk about their ability to deliver addressable advertising into recorded content that's held on hard drives in set-top boxes. And it's actually launched on some platforms around Europe. So we do like to get that on the board. And in a way, it's a form of on-demand. When you hold a program in digital format on a hard drive, whether it's in your home or on a server, you know, it's a form of on-demand content that ads can be delivered into. So again, linear channels and broadcast was telly for a long time. And then eventually, down at the bottom right, the internet arrived and brought with it all of the disruption that we know about. And eventually, the internet got its head around video. And initially, we saw the broadcasters launch catch-up players, these apps that sat out there with a number of different content formats in them. So first off, ad-supported content appeared in catch-up players, what we now call AVOD, advertiser funded video on demand. So AVOD content was the very first kind of content we saw in broadcast apps. And then reasonably quickly, we saw the broadcasters able to deliver streamed versions of the live channel, what some markets call simulcast, simultaneous casting of linear IP channels. So it was possible in lots of markets to open up a broadcaster's catch-up app and actually find live television as well as on demand. And then evolution of the television landscape started to pick up quite quickly. So very quickly, catch-up on-demand television migrated from just being in apps over on the internet in our personal devices into set-top boxes. We saw that set-top boxes around Europe began to plug broadband into the back of the box and deliver internet-delivered content into them. And the first content we saw was AVOD, advertiser-funded on demand. And then pretty quickly, we saw platforms, particularly those platforms which are owned by internet service providers, ISPs, or telcos of some form. We saw them very quickly introduce internet-delivered channels. So suddenly over in mainstream television, if you have a reasonably sophisticated set-top box, we have to reflect that you've got at least two mechanisms for getting broadcast television into your boxes, and you've got recordings, and you've got on-demand. And as we know, evolution has kept happening, kept going in TV. We saw the arrival of social video, YouTube and Facebook, etc. And we saw the arrival over on the internet of subscription video on demand, SVOD, like Netflix, etc. And once again, in the last couple of years, we've seen those concepts starting off over in the bottom right, leaping up into set-top boxes. So SVOD has come up into televisions. We've seen Netflix launch on multiple set-top boxes and platforms and connected televisions around Europe. And Netflix viewing by hour has shifted from personal devices up onto big screen devices, as we talked about earlier on. And the same thing now with YouTube in particular. It's not uncommon to find a YouTube app in smart TVs and increasingly in the closed platform set-top boxes that dominate the pay TV world. So what you've got from a content point of view, and we're looking at this, don't forget, from the advertising industry's point of view, we've got a set of content formats which are very varied in both their layouts and the technology by which they get into our boxes or our screens. So when, from an advertising point of view, we look at this, there's some significant questions about how would we and how could we insert advertising into all these formats. If we take SVOD off for a moment and just focus on it, this really is the landscape that we're now looking at in TV. The rise of IP linear channels within that mix, we think, is very significant. We don't talk about this very much in the European television landscape, but it is likely that a much greater percentage of live broadcast television will be delivered into our set-top boxes and in our screens as IP streams over the next few years, as broadcasters are able to capture the cost savings of doing that. And we believe that the broadcast channels will come to be just the big, expensive, shiny HD, ultra HD channels dominating the spectrum. So we will have a mixed economy. And that obviously, again, has implications on how we deliver addressability. So I just want to spend a moment looking at IP linear, because you would think this is a reasonably simple thing. Plug an Ethernet cable into the back of a box or back into a screen and just stream a channel into a telly. But it's not quite so simple. And we're going to make the case that there's actually two versions of this. From a content consumption point of view, this doesn't make a whole lot of difference to viewers. From an advertiser's point of view, this is absolutely crucial to understand this distinction, because the way that advertising can be configured from an addressable point of view on these two different kinds of IP is hugely important. So I'm just going to go and look at, for a moment, how we get telly into our homes. So if we look at this chart, I've got two forms of telly currently on the chart. So on the left, broadcast telly. It's the traditional format for delivering telly into our boxes, whether it comes over an aerial or from a satellite. The idea being that once a broadcast channel is live and in the air, it can be delivered to an unlimited number of homes. As long as the broadcast signal is in the air, any home with the ability to receive it can watch that broadcast channel. But as we know from an advertising point of view, it means that adverts are a very blunt tool in that world. One advert in that channel gets shown indiscriminately to every single one of those little grey dots representing the homes. In the middle of the chart, I've got what I've put up there as unicast networks. Now, this is the traditional way of streaming television channels over the internet. So if you have ever watched a simulcast channel in an app on your phone, if you've ever watched pretty much any stream content to a PC, it's likely it was using the oldest form of internet channel delivery, which is called unicast. And the reason we call it unicast, the uni is the key word there, is that when you have a server playing out that channel, it has to create a unique stream from that server to any particular device that's out there. So if you have 50,000 homes watching a live stream of a television channel, the server has to be able to deliver, or the configuration of servers around the country have to be able to deliver 50,000 streams of that channel at once. And very rough rule of thumb has always been that this is able, as a technology, has been able to deliver linear channels out into the device world, whether it's set-top boxes or phones and tablets, it doesn't matter. It's been able to deliver that. And once you go above 150,000 homes all watching the same live channel, the same IP stream of a live channel, above that number, it becomes very flaky and liable to fall over. And we've seen a few instances where live channels, particularly around sports games, their streams have failed because too many people have tried to log on to the servers and watch them. And what's happened in the last few years is that the football industries, in particular in Europe, have wanted to explore how to deliver more football to more people using the internet as well as broadcast. And it became clear very quickly that the old technology, this unicast way of doing it, wasn't good enough. And what we saw around Europe are telcos starting to work on a new form of internet delivery called multicast. And now multicast networks are now available in most European countries to deliver television channels. And the way that a multicast network works is that you have a single server sending out one major internet stream to a splitter, which is in a small box on the side of the road somewhere near to where the houses and flats are that I want to watch the telly. And the signal only gets split right out at the point where the houses want to consume it. It's a much more efficient industrial scale way of delivering a broadcast channel over the internet in this new world. And as I say, from a content point of view, it makes no difference really to the broadcasters and to the viewers. However, from an advertising point of view, it has a significant impact because all of the ad insertion technology that we're going to talk about later on has been built for the internet for unicast streaming. So when we get in a moment to talk about digital ad insertion, dynamic ad insertion into live streams, all of the technology is designed for unicast, and almost none of it currently has been configured to deal with multicast networks. And so there is a kind of a technology catch-up that has to happen if we want the newer forms of advertising and addressable advertising, etc., to be able to work on the new forms of internet. So we're having a bit of a lag at the moment. So that's crucial to us, that split between the two. And so when we look into a set-top box, this is a telco-based set-top box in the UK. You can see here Sky Sports. That is a channel which is delivered over IP. You can see that those three little dots indicate that this is an internet channel. Without those dots, you wouldn't know that this wasn't delivered through an aerial or a satellite dish. It behaves, its quality is high, it behaves like a normal linear channel, but it's actually a multicast channel running over the telecoms company's own multicast network. So there it is sitting there. And we expect across Europe that television companies will actually have all three of those things in their system. They will have broadcast over the air, whether it's free to air or pay, whether it's standard definition SD or HD. It's likely that most television platforms and most smart tellies will still have a significant amount of broadcast, and it's the broadcast channels form the basis of the electronic program guide, the EPG. And of course, they are recordable on personal video recorders. Multicast is growing, particularly for sport. And the way the technology works, it's very easy for multicast channels to appear on the electronic program guide and to be recordable. So they behave very much like a broadcast channel does in a number of ways. However, the problem we have with them, as I've mentioned, is that the ad technologies aren't there yet to deliver dynamic ad insertion into multicast networks. And then we do expect lots of smaller, tiny channels to still use the old-fashioned unicast mechanism for doing that. It makes it harder to have them, to give them a numbered line in the electronic program guide. It makes it hard for them to be recordable, but oddly, it makes them includable in our landscape for advanced television. So that's the two different forms of internet-delivered television channels lining up against broadcast. And as I say, we're expecting all three to be there. So from an advertising point of view, we have to reflect on those differences when we consider IP linear. We'll come back to that. So as I said, from an advertising specific point of view, broadcast is fine if you've got one of the new systems we'll talk about in a moment. Multicast has to be done at the splitter, and we'll talk more about that in just a moment. And unicast can be done at the server as normal. So back to our landscape of television. Having said that there's two forms of internet stream channel, the other thing I want to flag up is there's also two forms of on-demand and set-top boxes. And again, the only area where this delivers a significant difference is advertising. From a content point of view, from a rights point of view, it doesn't really make a big difference. But from an advertising point of view, this is absolutely crucial. And I just wanted to flag up again what the two forms of on-demand telly are that we're seeing emerging into the set-top box world. So if we take two setups, a set-top box on the left and a smart TV on the right, there are around Europe a number of what we call closed platforms. These tend to be the cable platforms. So UPC, SBS in Belgium, Virgin in Ireland and in the UK, and Sky, the satellite platforms around Europe, Canal Satellite, etc. So the what we could term to be the older traditional pay TV platforms, where the platform itself is in control of all of the software through their system. And in those worlds, the platform is in control of a lot more of the VOD playout. And what you find is a broadcaster has to send their programming as individual programs to the platform to be coded in that platform's proprietary code and played out through that platform's own on-demand system, so that when you play a program from a national broadcaster, it's played out over that platform's VOD system. In the other corner are the growth of what we would call the web-based platforms and the smart TV screens. And if we look at all of the telco television platforms around Europe, they tend to be much more open, much more web-based, because they don't own the full software stack from start to finish in the way that the traditional platforms do, and they've had to rely on the broadcasters delivering their own broadcast apps into those systems. And so you can have two platforms next to each other in two houses, one being one of the traditional closed platforms, the other being a web-based platform. They can both have the on-demand content from one of the major broadcasters in that territory. They may even look very similar on screen, but once you get into the on-demand, you realize they're different. And in the web-based ones, they tend to look a lot like the web players that are on the PC and on the mobile phones, etc., because they're actually the broadcaster's own app running web video over the internet from the web servers that are run by the broadcasters into a piece of software that's managed by the television platform, but they don't run the VOD. And the reason this distinction is important is that on the left-hand side, it's the platform that will sell the on-demand advertising. It's the platform's data that can be used to target, and it's the platform's own measurement systems that will be required to report and measure on any campaign. Whereas those devices and services like the smart TVs and the web-based set-top boxes, it's the broadcaster's platform that targets and captures usage and data and delivers the on-demand advertising. So very, very different. In the second video, we're going to pick that idea apart, the difference between a platform and the difference between a broadcaster and what they can deliver and where they can deliver it. So we will come back and explore that in a bit more detail, but I just wanted to explain that there is two very different environments for on-demand telly around Europe. And just to finish off, just on the web-based smart TV platforms, if you open up a smart TV, there are, as we know, a large number of apps that appear and are available for you to watch content through, and obviously to experience advertising through. And if we look at the web apps, there's a kind of a cluster of them. We like to break them down into a certain group. So there are, around Europe, there are broadcaster video on demand apps. The apps that are the on-demand apps that are owned by the major broadcasters in every market. When we talk about them, we like to break those actually into two groups, what we call integrated and non-integrated. What we're seeing again around Europe are television platforms that are looking to use techniques like the backwards electronic program guide to blend linear and on-demand from certain broadcasters into a much more cohesive whole. It's very advanced. It's only in kind of 4 or 5 markets, but the backwards EPG linking a broadcast channel with its own VOD app in the App Store. So there are broadcasters that have that, and there are broadcasters that aren't integrated and just have their own catch-up and archive on demand sitting in app on a smart TV. And then next to them, and so yes, the integrated ones tend to be the large public sector broadcasters in a market, the large free-to-air channels. The non-integrated ones tend to be the pay TV channels because they're much more standardized across Europe. Then sitting alongside those, you can argue there is a second tier of ad-supported apps that we need to take a look at. And in the second video, we'll be looking at the role of ad sales from smart TV companies and ad sales from operating system companies like Roku and like Samsung. And very often they talk about selling ads into content, and they are very often talking about this, what we would call the second tier ads. So this is Rakuten, Acorn, Twitch, the apps that sit on there that contain advertising, but probably aren't in the top rank of the content and suppliers that you would consider in the market. And then, as we know, on smart TVs around the world, there is also social. So there is YouTube, Facebook, Vivo, etc. There is a set of social video apps arriving on television that contain advertising and have to be considered when we're having a debate about advertising. There is, of course, on every smart TV, there is also subscription VOD, but obviously, you know, they don't have ads, so they don't fall into this debate. However, they're significant in terms of the total viewing time they take up. So we just have to be aware that they are there. Great. So I just want to wrap up that first section and just discuss what we learned in that section. What do we cover? So you'll see that we're making the case that the television landscape in Europe has a long way down the road towards convergence between internet concepts and IP type content and traditional broadcast television. Convergence is happening and it's here. Within that, there are significant shifts from watching broadcast telly, watching linear channels, through to watching on demand. And those shifts continue, and we don't see them stopping for a while, yet we don't see them as fundamentally changing the market. At the same time, we've seen shifts from watching telly on the big screen through to the small screen. And I think we make the case that actually that shift may be reversing and turning back into a shift up onto the large screen. We saw that both linear and on demand are going through their own tech evolution. That hasn't stopped. Linear in particular has an unheralded set of evolutions, and we think it's quite exciting, particularly the shift from over-the-air broadcast into IP. And our sense is that advertisers and brand advertisers really need to be aware of the complexity in television distribution that's emerging, because it's significant, and obviously it has a big impact on how advertising can be configured and delivered into the market. So let's move on to the next section. So the mechanisms by which addressability is delivered to the viewer on their screen. So again, we're going to delve into some slides. So the mechanisms. This is as techy as we get in any of our presentations, and those of you who know us will know that we're not a tech consultancy. But when we're talking about addressability, it's unfortunate that we have to consider some of the more complex issues that are being built into the television markets. When we look at who potentially could sell us an addressable TV campaign, we break the market down into 5 potential players. So platforms, we've talked a little bit about, the big television platforms, which include set-top boxes and very often broadband supply, etc. Broadcasters, they themselves, that category covers a range of broadcasters from large nationals through to small specialist pay companies. The VOD apps we've talked about, we've broken down into certain categories. And then by publisher, we mean those second tier players. We talked a while ago about Rakuten and Acorn and that genre of video publishers with apps where there's no broadcast channel relating to that app at all. And then obviously agencies. A lot of the talk around addressable TV is coming from the big agency groups or tech agencies or data agencies who are talking about an addressable TV proposition. So they're the 5 players in the market. And in video 2, we're going to break those down again into more detail and probe the capabilities of each of those sectors. However, for now, we just want to focus on the technical mechanism by which any of those can get an addressable TV campaign into your home or into your device. And we're going to talk about this kind of complex landscape for TV that we've just described, where there's television platforms connected to set-top boxes, there's smart televisions connected to the internet, there's television being beamed in by satellite or from the air over the aerial, and there's television being streamed in on demand and live as channels over IP. So that's the picture we're going to break down. And we're going to look at advertising around 4 areas. So if we consider traditional internet, so for a long time, video has been delivered into apps over the internet from servers, advertising has been configured, and a whole market and technology has been configured to deliver content into those apps. We've described a world in which that has been extended via unicast internet and via multicast internet into the platform world, and also the apps and the connected TV screens that go with it. So various forms of internet delivery, unicast and multicast, delivering linear, delivering on demand, alongside broadcast being delivered into all those things. So that's the world we're talking about. We're going to make the case in this section that there's 4 areas where you can build addressable TV capability. We'll call server side, the splitter, at the roadside, at the set-top box, and at the connected screen. And you'll see that we've got, on the server side, we've got DAI, dynamic ad insertion. We'll talk about that in a moment. And on the connected streams, we've got ACR, automatic content recognition. We'll talk about that again in just a moment. So they're the 4 areas: DAI, splitters, set-top boxes, and screens. So we'll start with the first of those. We'll start and have a look at how advertising gets into our home over IP streams using unicast IP streams. And as I said at the beginning, the original technology just into apps on our laptops and our phones, etc., it's been expanded into closed platforms and onto connected TV screens. Now, it's possible to use what's actually becoming a traditional form of digital ad insertion. This is the technology by which most ads are delivered into internet video or across devices, and it is possible for that technology to just be extended into audience devices, whether they're closed platforms or connected TV screens, and that's actually happening. There are some howevers, there's some challenges when we look at that. The first is that on most television devices, we don't have any of those technologies or mechanisms that have enabled advertising and targeting and addressability to be delivered into phones and tablets and laptops. As I mentioned earlier on, there is no presumption of login on these bigger screens. There's a much stronger, particularly around television, a much stronger presumption of login and data capture on personal apps and devices, and it just isn't there on set-top boxes. So set-top boxes don't have cookies, they don't have ID exchange mechanisms. On closed platforms, the account management systems of those platforms do keep set-top box IDs, they do keep personal IDs, and they build obviously data around the household users. So within the closed platform world, there is a significant amount of data that can be brought to bear. That just doesn't exist in a world of smart and connected TV screens and other data that's on it. So if you want to do ad insertion at a server into set-top boxes, it does require close interaction between broadcasters and the platforms who own the kit if you want to achieve it. You also have to accept that you are only going to be able to target either household level identity, if you can capture it, because you can't tell who's actually using a shared device like a television, or you just accept that one person may be logged into an app on a television and you target that person's identity without necessarily knowing whether they're the person who's watching content at any one time. So there's a disconnect between this original traditional digital ad insertion mechanism for inserting ads into, particularly into a linear IP channel that's delivered into a television set-top box or a connected screen, versus the how you would do it on a personal device. And over time, we are expecting a dramatic improvement in the platform tech. We're expecting the technology and the software that's in the closed platforms to slowly evolve and be much more web friendly and to be able to interact better with internet streams. And we're expecting technologies like HbbTV into smart televisions to again allow greater interaction between broadcast and linear IP. So both those worlds will improve as technology improves. But right now, if you are a broadcaster streaming a small channel into a set-top box or connected screen, it's very hard to deliver addressable TV over the internet at the moment. Just a quick aside about multicast. I made the point earlier on that there was two forms of internet that we're talking about, unicast and multicast. Multicast is very exciting, as we talked about, because it allows much larger numbers to watch a television channel. So on average, we can jump from 50,000 to a million, half a million, a million without a problem using multicast. It also allows broadcasters to dramatically improve the quality of signal. So it's been interesting around Europe to see that the first Ultra HD 4K coverage of football, Champions League in particular, has been delivered into set-top boxes running multicast IP, and it's been delivered in as IP streams. So in a number of countries around Europe, the first 4K broadcast football was delivered as a multicast IP stream. So multicast sounds limited when we look at it from the world of advertising, but from the world of television distribution, it's a real breakthrough. But we do need to solve how advertising is delivered into the mix. Now, you'll remember from the diagram previously, I talked about a single wholesale stream of a channel being delivered from the server out to the roadside, or what the cable industry would call the head end, and the signal only being split at that point into an individual signal for households. And what that tells us is that when we're looking to build an addressable TV capability that can work over this new generation of internet streams, we're going to end up having to put advertising servers right out at the head end, right out of the roadside. So the telcos who run these systems are going to have to integrate advertising into their network topology, which obviously gets much more complicated because you're moving data and content around the systems. But so that's really what's going to have to happen. The cable industry is pioneering this activity because they have, for years, they've been based on a system of cables and head ends. So the cable industry knows about head ends and how to create a distributed landscape for content and for advertising. So we need, as I say, we need the telcos to build the infrastructure, or we need the telcos to build much more sophisticated set-top boxes and do the work at the set-top box. And very often when we're thinking about addressable TV technology, that's part of the debate we're having. Where should we build the ad tech infrastructure? Should we build it at the roadside? But as you'll see in a minute, very often the cleverest thing to do is actually to build it into the set-top box. Now, clearly with a connected TV screen, we don't have set-top boxes, and I'll touch on that in just a moment. And where we do have set-top boxes, and particularly the telco internet service provider platforms, there is a worrying trait at the moment, which is to trade down those boxes. And we're seeing more and more telcos around Europe give up their own set-top box development, just at a time the advertising industry would actually need them to do something more sophisticated. And we're seeing telcos around Europe start to give away Apple boxes, for instance, or small Android TV boxes, rather than developing their own set-top boxes. So when we look at the set-top box infrastructure from an advertising industry point of view, it's kind of alarming. And one of my calls to action for the agency world is to engage with the telcos and tell them what we want them to build. The advertising industry has been very poor at going out and telling people what we need them to build. So having bigged up this set-top box, this is probably where most of the very exciting stuff is happening in America, in the UK, in Europe. It's those closed platforms that have built addressable advertising systems which are centered around the set-top box. So, if we look at what companies like SBS have done in Belgium, the parent UPC are doing in Holland, in Ireland, and eventually UK. A lot of what they're doing is centered around innovation at the set-top box. But of course, it's quite complex what has to happen there. If you think about it, into the software of a set-top box, you have to put an intelligence engine, a decisioning engine that can manage and run a campaign for you in the set-top box. that thing has to talk back over the broadband to your customer service systems to be able to exchange data. It has to talk to your advertising systems so that the set-top box can receive commands about an advertising campaign and implement those commands when broadcast arrives. You have to have an ad server. And there's various ways that's happening. So some ad servers are able to receive ads that are broadcast and hold them on a hard drive. Some ad servers in this situation, in set-top boxes, take ads delivered up broadband and hold them there waiting for a broadcast signal. And then, of course, you need software. The complicated bit is the ad insertion software. Now, the reason we're so excited about advertising technologies being developed at the set-top box is that it's the one place in the whole of the network topology we've described where you can insert advertising into IP streams, yes, as we've described, but also into broadcast channels that are delivered over the air. So from a satellite, from an aerial, etc. The one place where all the content comes together is at the set-top box. So the reason we like having ad insertion software there is that's where you can do really interesting things by bringing all this stuff together. But as I say, this is big, large-scale software engineering to make this stuff happen. And the television industry is very intolerant of mistakes. So when you're building ad insertion software, you have to do a lot of work to make sure that the ads that you're putting into the broadcast streams go in seamlessly and don't overlap the programs and don't have mistakes. So it's very difficult. When we look at companies like Sky around Europe and UBC, what they're also beginning to do is create television systems for multiple screens around the home. And in that instance, when you add in a screen like that, if you look, we changed the set-top box on the first screen to say media server, because actually what's beginning to happen in this new arrangement for television is that the major set-top box in a home is becoming the center of a local area network for telly in your home, with the set-top box being a media server containing with it all those components I've listed out at the bottom, which are the ad server. And it's an interesting thought that these companies are actually running and managing ad servers in our homes through which they can advertise on screens around the house to us. Obviously, they don't talk about like that to customers. It would scare them. But it is a very strange thing that companies on our behalf are running ad servers in our lounges. And of course, those ad servers can send ads to apps which are running on the same broadband network as the set-top boxes on our phones and tablets. So when we kind of summarize that, working at the set-top box allows addressable advertising to be inserted into broadcast channels, IP linear, on demand. It allows us to insert addressable campaigns into recorded programs that are recorded on the personal video recorder, the PVR, in our homes. And this enables a set-top box to become an ad server and a media server around our home. It's a significant piece of engineering, but if you can do it and you can control it, then it's really interesting. And the next video, we're going to ask who those companies are currently and which new companies potentially are moving into that world. But just to remind you, the new companies have to be companies big enough to build sophisticated set-top boxes and data and ad infrastructure to serve them. That obviously favors very large vertically integrated television platforms, of which there aren't many. And as we see mergers around Europe, they will get fewer and fewer. However, some of we'll talk in the second video about big new entrants who can do this. And just a reminder, HbbTV again, across Europe, there is this new software standard, HbbTV, which enables reasonably simple set-top boxes to do clever things, combining broadcast with IP, internet-delivered channels and content. And the latest standard for HbbTV 2.0 has become kind of accepted around Europe, and most smart screens and most set-top boxes that we're seeing rolling out in this new generation are compatible with this new service. So finally, we have a development landscape which is accepting of broadcast and IP combining and converging together, and the advertising world can play into that. So we are expecting over the next few years much more innovation around that. And then finally, the connected screen. We know around Europe, smart tellies from the major manufacturers are getting cheaper and better, and they're rolling out. The number of those smart tellies in European homes is increasing dramatically, and they enable a certain number of things. We've talked a moment ago about on-demand and the apps that we're seeing on connected TVs, and you'll remember I talked about the different categories of apps. The ability to deliver addressable advertising into an on-demand app on a connected TV screen really doesn't need too much deliberation, because it's just a variant on the original way that we delivered targeted video into apps on our phones. And in that context, a connected TV screen is just a big iPad running apps. It gets much more interesting if you try and do something clever with broadcast television on a connected screen like this. And you'll see that a number of companies are talking about a technology called ACR. Now, at the moment, ACR, automatic content recognition, is a technology that is being used much more frequently in America than it is in Europe. But there are technologies over here that are starting to talk about rolling it out. And there are companies like Samsung, again, we'll talk about in the second video, who are doing it. I just want to explain how that works. How does content recognition work on a screen, and why does that enable us to insert advertising? First of all, you have to assume that there is software loaded in the screen from one of the companies doing it. Lots of the new tellies are being shipped with this software already built in. So the software to do this. And secondly, you need consumers' permission to do this. And this is very often the slightly more complicated area. Over the last few years, some smart television manufacturers have loaded up software onto their smart screens and put up permission boxes in front of consumers to ask them to click permit, to give permission to do addressable advertising and to capture data. And it's caused some disquiet amongst consumers because they don't know what they're being asked to sign off. So nowadays, predominantly this permission and software loading is being done at sale. So the screens come preloaded with the right software. Then over in the playout, let's imagine a channel is ready to play out. The company that wants to run the ACR service, as well as having software on the screen, they have to have software installed at the television broadcast playout center. And as the channel gets ready to be played out, the company makes a copy of the channel in software, and they create what they call a key. Very often it's an audio key. It's just a recording of the channel that they can use to recognize the channel later on. And that key has to be then instantaneously distributed over the internet from their ACR server to the connected screens that want to play. And at that point, the channel gets broadcast out. And if all of those pieces are in place and they're all working, then the software in the television can, using the key, listen to the channel that's being played out on the screen and recognize it as a channel that it recognizes from the key. And at that point, the channel then is in play to do interesting things. And if the broadcast channel wants to, at that point, then you can, using the decision engine in the system, the ad server that's sitting back on the ACR company server, you can, with the inclusion of some ad insertion technologies in the telly, which hopefully are still there, you can start adding ads into, or overwriting ads that are in broadcast channels as the broadcast channel appears through the television screen. So you're literally overwriting an ad with another ad as the broadcast channel is delivered to the screen. And you'll hear this phrase, "at the glass." It's happening right at the point where the television channel is appearing on the glass of the connected TV screen. The problem with automatic content recognition is that it's complicated. There's a lot of moving parts, and it's always seems to be happening into a television screen that isn't managed in the way that a pay TV platform set-top box is. So whilst it's very easy to draw a diagram like this that shows this, it's actually a lot of moving parts, and there aren't many instances of where this has really been made to play properly. It's much easier to use a lot of this technology to deliver ads into the on-demand apps than it is for live television. So that's what ACR is. We've put it favors broadcasters over platforms. I must be careful of that phrase, because what it really does, it enables broadcasters to control ad insertion on a smart TV screen, whereas on a closed platform, the broadcasters aren't in control of the process. So it gives the semblance of control over addressability to a broadcaster, but it needs better data. One of the caveats we have with using ACR to deliver addressable formats into smart tellies is that the broadcasters who are talking about doing it very often don't have much data to do it with, unless you can encourage a viewer to log into your app on the screen. So if you're a major broadcaster, you have an on-demand app within the connected TV screen, and you can convince a viewer to go in and to log in and set up an account, then theoretically you can capture sufficient data about that viewer or about that household to do something interesting. But the volume of data a broadcaster will have will be a fraction of the data that a platform would have using the same system. So ACR, automatic content recognition, it's rolling out, it's there as a technology. You'll hear it talked about in conferences. We still have some significant questions over whether all the bits can be made to play, particularly around linear television, and whether the broadcasters themselves can actually exploit that opportunity because of the need for better data. It's complicated without yet clear material advantages for why you'd want to do it. So there were the four mechanisms we talked about: servers, the splitter side, both servers and splitter, both of them IP mechanisms. The set-top box, a much more complicated but much more rounded area where an addressable TV landscape can be built. And then the connected screens, ACR. If we just come back out of the slides for a minute, we can have a little summary. So that was the second section, the mechanisms. And what do we cover in that area? So you'll notice we saw that the companies that control devices and hardware and networks are in a much better position to control this market than those companies who just control content and broadcast. So we're really looking at companies that can control both ends of the distribution network, at the server or the playout end, and also have some kind of control over consumer devices in the home. And that's because they can then control the tech and the data that is required to deliver addressable TV. The set-top box in that world, it appears at the moment, has got more power and more control than screens. A lot of that is because the set-top boxes tend to be in what we were describing earlier on as closed pay environments where one company can control all the software, but at the moment it just seems that they have the ability to deliver more control around an addressable TV campaign than just a pure smart TV. Those companies that can control content and systems across providers are also in a very good position. So we're making the case that it's much harder for a single broadcaster or a single content company to be able to deliver the same breadth of campaign and the same breadth of functionality across lots of broadcasters than a platform can. And in the same vein, those companies that can capture data across usage, across all content formats, across all broadcasters and all content providers, again, are in a much stronger place to be able to create, capture, and deliver an addressable TV campaign. So that was the second section. And now we get into the third and last section. So the potential formats. How could and should addressable TV formats be used, and what's their role within a broader marketing campaign? So I'm going to go back into the slides. So the formats that are possible in the technical world that I just described. So the context for television. Before getting into individual formats and addressable formats and how and why we might use them, I just wanted to talk about the broad context for targeting and the debate about targeting, because very often, I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation this notion that there's TV and digital, and TV is a blunt tool and digital is this perfectly targeted tool. And I just want to disabuse that, because I want to start the debate about the use of addressable formats with everybody understanding that television itself is already a complex and nuanced medium. So when we look at this world, you'll see that, again, I've broken the screen into television top left and the internet bottom right, and you'll see why I've done that. When we look at television and television targeting, there is a characterization, particularly amongst the internet crowd, that television is a very blunt tool. It just delivers national or regional targets. And if you want to do anything cleverer, then you have to go over to the internet. This big broadcast, that's all it does. And we know that's just not true. We know that we know that there's much more kind of complex, and I'll come back to it in just a moment. Over on the internet, on the right-hand side, the promise of the internet is that it's a perfectly targeted medium. That the internet delivers individual IDs and can address advertising all the time down to personal level, and that's always been the promise. And we know at the same time that that's not true as well. And that very often the internet is doing much blunter things. And so if you go back onto television, we know that around Europe, in most European markets, there is regional targeting available for advertisers. Whether you're in the UK, in Belgium, Germany, we'll be slowly going around Europe, identifying those markets that break down for broadcasters, enable broadcasters to deliver regional targets, either 3 or 4 regions of the market, or somewhere you can get up to 20 or 30 regions as a broadcaster. And what that means is that television, even just on a geographic targeting basis, is already a reasonably sophisticated medium. But we know that within media agencies, the great skill of a media agency person using television as a targeting mechanism is that they have choices like a choice of the day part that they put advertising in, a choice of channel, a choice of program. So there are a number of ways that you can currently, before the advent of addressable technology, target television. I'm kind of teaching things that I know, but I wanted to put them out there on the table before we discuss addressability, because it's about the context. We don't talk enough about how targetable television is as a medium. Back over on the internet, that notion that the internet is just individual IDs, we know not to be true. We know that a huge amount of targeting on the internet is by broad attribute and by inferred data, by media owners trying to infer something or learn something about something based on some behavior or some past behavior, and invent attributes that they can map onto. So, a huge amount of the internet advertising is by slightly fluffy data, but by computing standards. And also a large amount of internet targeting is actually by household or by IP address. And again, we don't talk about how blunt and inaccurate a weapon, an IP address, is on its own. And you no doubt will all have received the wrong advertising because someone else in your household has done some shopping or some browsing. And if you are now using the same IP address, you're receiving advertising targeted for them. So we know the internet is actually itself a very blunt weapon, and that TV is a much more kind of complex, nuanced weapon than we often talk about. So I wanted that landscape to be up on the board before we start talking about how addressability is bringing a lot more of the capability on the right-hand side of the chart into the world of TV. So we know that contextual targeting for the first time, because of data, is possible within broadcast and on-demand television campaigns. The idea that we can go and find an audience based on a behavior, go and find an audience based on purchase behavior. So suddenly, for the first time, some of those capabilities around context that only existed on the internet are now arriving in television, and that's very exciting. And when we look at targeting, as well as regional targeting, addressability is bringing us various forms of other geographic targeting now. Hyperlocal is the most obvious, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. But the idea that you can target a campaign only to one very tight geographic area, or do different things in one geographic area than is happening in the rest of your campaign, is very exciting. And as well as hyperlocal, there's proximity location targeting. And we're beginning to see people talk about running campaigns that only play out into houses within 10 miles of a certain kind of retail store, or within a certain distance of a certain kind of entertainment store. So the idea that you can create geographic mixes in a TV audience for the first time is very exciting. And as we know, attribute targeting with using third-party data, TBD, is out there and being discussed, as well as very close identity targeting using first-party data. So the use of third-party and first-party data within TV targeting mechanisms using these other things is suddenly with us. So the broad point we're trying to make is that addressability within telly is just one component of a broader targeting landscape that was already complex and interesting for TV, but has just become more nuanced and more flexible. So it's a very good thing, particularly around attribute targeting. We know that this is SBS in Belgium. It's talking about attributes. Sky in the UK. That this is a language now that is really crossing over between the old internet and data type targeting and the TV planning world. So there's a mixture of skills, which in itself is a challenge and a problem, which I'll touch on later on. So addressability, what are the formats? Now, this is a difficult challenge to articulate, because in reality, we're still waiting for a lot of the technology to roll out. So to a certain extent, we're beginning to make guesses about the nature of an addressable TV campaign. What is it? Why would you do it? Who would use it? What data would you need to measure it? And what we've done to prepare for this is gone out and talked to a range of addressable TV companies and brands across Europe. And we've started to group them into kind of 6 groups. And I'm going to go through them and discuss them one by one. And then in the second video, we're going to pull some case studies that kind of highlight who's doing this in each one. But at the moment, our premise is, you can argue there are 6 forms of addressable campaign that are available because of the technology landscape and the targeting landscape that we discussed in the first 2 sections of the presentation. So let's go through those. So shared ad breaks. This is a fun one. When we worked on the early arrival of addressable TV in Europe, and this was the case study that we all thought would take over and be the most popular. The notion that one organization, whether it was an umbrella brand or an agency, buys a spot on television and then shares the use of that spot among sub-brands and products under its umbrella. Now, this might be a product split target. And the example we all used in the early days of addressable TV was cars. And we used to use a Ford car example. So if you had 5 families in a row in a street, all watching the same live television channel, they would see 5 different ads served, you probably using the set-top box example that we just talked through, and it would serve a different ad into the broadcast channel for 5 different families based on their characteristics. So a family might see an ad for a hatchback car, single people might see a small, fun runaround car, but the idea was one brand advertiser dividing up a spot between a number of its products. We also talked about something slightly scarier, a product split by company, where an agency takes a spot. So an advertising agency buys a significant spot on telly and divides the use of that spot up by its own clients. This was a very utopian example that we talked a lot about, and it didn't really last the first exposure to the agency world, or the first trial by customers. We thought this would be used by car manufacturers, by financial services companies, by airlines, where there was lots of different products under their brand umbrella. What people have said to us, those who've tried it and experienced it, is, first of all, you would only do this if there was an ad spot that was significantly important enough to want to spend all of this time and all this work on a single ad spot. And most addressable TV campaigns into linear and broadcast are actually distributed around 2nd and 3rd tier channels where there is redundant inventory to play with, not premium spots. So the example that was always used for this case study was the centre break, or first ad in break, in a Champions League game, a live football game with a very large audience, a very diverse audience in which you could find subgroups, and a very high likelihood that the ad break will be viewed, and that the ad break will be viewed by lots of different people. So that in itself was a limiting factor for this format of addressability. The idea that there was only a small number of these kind of Super Bowl quality ad spots you would want to do this with. And secondly, when we road tested this with agencies, with brands, the notion was actually, yes, commercially you could understand this would be possible, but it fails the most kind of practicality tests that brand groups and agencies could define. And what they said to us was, can you imagine how complicated and just how hard it is to organize the brand managers with their campaigns and their budgets from 5 different parts of our organization and get them to work together through potentially 5 separate teams in our agencies to all work together to point their campaigns at a single spot. And so it kind of failed this basic human test, that it was just much too complicated coordinating budgets and campaigns to make this practical. So this is always held up as the kind of the theoretical addressable TV format. And as I say, it's the least practical, it turns out, once it gets exposed to humans. So, and on that final company, the notion that one agency might take over one spot and divide it up between its products, the media owners, the broadcasters were horrified by that idea, that they would give control of an ad spot to an agency with all the regulatory issues that come with it. So shared ad breaks are a great concept to talk about, a great technology to build, not so great as an ad medium to be playing with. So frequency management. This was another interesting one that came from lots of debates. There was an assumption early on in our debate about addressability that big brand advertisers, and particularly things like FMCG, they wouldn't want to play with addressability because they needed big brand campaigns, big national campaigns where everybody saw the same ads at once. And actually, in discussion with the big FMCG advertisers, we began to hear a story that was much more interesting. The notion that actually, if you run a big brand campaign for an FMCG product, very often, if you're looking to achieve a certain amount of cover and frequency across all segments, what you find is that sometimes some audience segments are much harder to hit than others. And in making sure that everybody has hit a certain level, including the hard to hit ones, you end up massively over serving ads to some groups of people. And so some groups of people would see an ad 20 times just to make sure that other people saw it twice. And those brand advertisers said to us that actually addressability added on to an existing campaign, not replacing it, but added on to an existing campaign, could allow them to manage this, this frequency issue when trying to hit difficult audiences. And that you could imagine every large brand campaign having this extra little bolt-on addressable component which dealt with that complex issue. There was also a question of sequencing. The notion that if you ran a campaign that had a series of ads in it that needed to be seen in a certain order, you could use this technology to make sure that once somebody had seen the ad a certain number of times, so you'd hit basic reach and frequency targets in a segment, that you could move them on to the next advert, even if people were still in other groups still watching the original advert. So the notion that you could introduce sequencing is discussed. What we hear back from advertisers, of course, is that there aren't that many ad campaigns that include sequencing in the mix. So it's an interesting idea with very limited kind of application. So in terms of just general frequency management, any major advertiser who tends not to work with customer data, so we would make the distinction between an airline and an FMCG company using this kind of ad format, much more likely that big FMCG would use it. And it needs some form of combination of measurement data and audience metrics, which we haven't really seen brought into play yet. So it's the first time you begin to think about how we need combined metrics for this world to cover both elements of a campaign. And this is one of those areas of engagement and debate that we're looking to promote. And it also requires oversight across a complete campaign in terms of delivery. So this is a format and a behavior which probably favors the larger platforms versus individual broadcasters or individual apps, because you would need to be able to control all consumption of television content within a household or a family to be able to manage this. And that's something that can only happen up at platform level. So a format favoring platforms over broadcasters, and a format favoring big brand advertisers over specialist data-fueled brand advertisers. But interesting that again, a strong case for brand advertising to be using addressability. The third case we talked about, what we call segmented messaging. So an advertiser, we're running one campaign, but delivering subtle different messages to different viewer groups based on either first-party data or third-party data. And so, with the first of those third-party data, this really is a subtle refinement on the first example, where you can kind of run message variations. So in this instance, we're assuming it will be different voiceovers, subtle different messages, but within the same video, within the same campaign context. And it might be slightly different audience segments. So an advertiser running a campaign that has got a slightly different message for customer groups, whether that customer is a lapsed customer, a current customer, or potentially a future potential customer. So first-party data can allow this behavior to be based around customer segments or audiences with an impending date. So everybody gets a brand message apart from those who've got a renewal date on a financial product or something. They can be given a stronger message. So this notion of one advertiser, one campaign, but segmenting their campaign around different messages and using addressability. And our assumptions when we've talked to people who've used this, it's been banks, it's been airlines, service-based advertisers who've got a lot of data on their customer and are able to use data and bring data to play in a campaign. This does feel like a modern tech version of what used to happen running different regional voiceovers across regional TV campaigns. So in a way, it's an upgrade of an existing media behavior and creative behavior that we've seen for years. However, when we've spoken to banks and insurance companies who've played with this is another area where the cost of management time and the cost of use comes up. So it's a concern that the amount of effort and extra cost required to achieve the campaign objectives is starting to make this not attractive, and it's one of those areas we need to work on. And what advertisers have told us is that one of the things stopping them using this kind of addressable TV is that actually one single piece of great television advertising can very often just cut through all of this and do the job of all these campaigns. And as we know with brand marketers and brand clients, they do like one big famous campaign. And so great creativity, oddly, could kill off this segmented messaging form of addressability. So now the two kind of geographic ones, hyperlocal. But first of all, hyperlocal within a bigger campaign. So if we look at some of the case studies we'll talk about in more detail tomorrow, what we're beginning to see is this notion that a big brand advertiser might deliver a national campaign, but within that national campaign, use addressability to give some slightly different messages based either on postcode or the proximity location thing I talked about before. So where audiences are included or excluded based on their proximity to a particular outlet. And this might be a national retailer running a television campaign, that if there's a new retail outlet opening, that anyone within a geographic radius of that outlet, they receive a slightly different message or an augmented message. It might be an advert to anyone who lives or works within 5 miles of a McDonald's within the context of a national campaign. So the ability to bring hyperlocal and proximity data into campaigns has actually opened up some functionality which advertisers are just now beginning to explore. Again, we need this combination metric worked on. We need to understand how we're combining both targeting metrics and the measurement metrics for these campaigns. and how we combine local and national data in this mix, because we haven't really nailed that yet as part of this. But it's an interesting challenge, and this appears to be an area where advertisers are starting to spot the benefit, as long as we can keep the management time and the management costs down sufficient to warrant doing this. And then standalone hyperlocal. This, to a certain extent, is the easiest to understand, because this is really just bringing onto television behavior that's already happening with social media video. So smaller tech startups, whether it's SME retail, SME from the entertainment industry, they are already using social media to do very hyperlocal campaigns. And bringing this capability up onto mainstream TV really allows the television industry to go and claim back money that has been lost to social media in the last 5 years. And again, this can be postcode, this can be proximity segments. It can be this really can be delivered by broadcasters and by platforms. It's a good area for broadcasters to focus on, because it's much more likely that a small or medium-sized company would run a campaign with a single broadcaster than it is a large national brand would do. So a small advertiser could have a very positive relationship with a single broadcaster running addressability into broadcast and into on-demand on big screen and small screen combined, by bringing first-party data into the mix as well. So small and medium-sized companies, tech startups working with a single broadcaster to use addressability up on the big screen will help television claim money back from social and the internet, and will also allow small businesses and tech businesses to gain some of the kudos and the status that they get from advertising on TV. And then the last group, again, is one of the more obvious addressable formats that seems to be taking off. The idea that you can dip in and just pull out one small segment from an audience. Typically, this is being looked at by luxury goods brands, finance brands, expensive car brands, travel brands, people who want to pull out a specific demographic or a specific behavior. Now, because of the cost of doing it, this is weighted towards the expensive brands, the luxury brands. We know they can afford the budget, and if they can encourage a single purchase of their product or service, it pays for a campaign. So we expect this to be one of the widest used addressable concepts. It would happen in addition to all the television advertising behavior we've seen. This probably won't be a change in behavior from existing television advertisers. Like the last example, this is probably going to be an area where we bring new advertisers onto television. It can be done with digital ad insertion into IP, into broadcast, into on-demand. Any of the formats we've talked about can play in this world. And this will come down to who's got the best quality data underpinning their attributes. And again, this could be an area where broadcasters play alone very well and compete very effectively against platforms, whereas they couldn't in other sectors. So I think what you've seen is that we've talked about this notion that there are different kinds of formats emerging, and that different players in the mix, whether you're a platform, a broadcaster, or an app, have or greater or lesser capability of delivering those formats to advertisers. And then different kinds of advertisers, an area that we haven't focused much on yet. Different kinds of advertisers can make different kinds of usage. So we would expect to see a fragmentation of the market, different advertisers grabbing onto different opportunities to exploit them, which is exciting. This is the kind of innovation we need to see for the market to evolve. Cool. So that was our third and final section. I just want to summarize that particular part before wrapping up all of the video. You'll see from what we presented that we don't believe addressable TV is a single thing. It's a broad set of technologies which allow a range of different campaign styles and techniques to be brought to bear, and that at the moment we only have detailed case studies on a few of those. It's clear that some of the most obvious ones that we talked a lot about in the early days of addressable TV probably aren't going to be those ones that come to play now. We've disproved the attractiveness of some of them, and the industry really now needs to look at the data and measurement and metric requirements of those formats that we talked about as we went through, because quite clearly as we went through, we pointed out there's a number of areas where we don't yet have good metrics, good data to support the kind of campaigns the technology is allowing. And this is a good example of where we want brands and advertisers to join the debate. The major concern, however, which we've articulated a few times as we talk through those formats, is that there is still a sense among lots of advertisers we talk to that the benefits that addressability can deliver as a set of technologies are not good enough. They don't outweigh the increased time and effort and cost to deliver an addressable campaign. And that's a significant thing we really need to work around. At the moment, a lot of advertisers are trying this stuff once and not going back. So we really need to reflect on why that is. So that was video one, the concepts. If I was to wrap up the whole video, I think we've made the case that television in general is still evolving across Europe. We're still seeing convergence between the web and television technologies. It's still going on, but there's a significant amount of converged media now in place. We're seeing the industry still experimenting with a variety of technologies, not just to deliver on-demand content, interactive content, but also to deliver addressable campaigns. Very little of addressable TV is stable and mature. It's clear that there's some politics. Who can win this game? Who's in control? And those organizations who control both playout and devices in the consumer's home seem to have market power in this world. The arrival of addressability, I think we could make the case, is not a seismic change. And I think that the broad feeling we come away from this discussion having is that addressability is another tool that brings some more refinement, some more nuance to television advertising, but it's not a seismic change from what we had before. And I think we made the case in the middle section of the video that in reality, this has helped us refine some behaviors amongst media planners that were already in place. It's brought new tools and it's brought new data, but it's not a fundamental change in the way that we use TV. And the opportunities that it brings sometimes are new and standalone. There will be new advertisers onto TV that have come onto TV because of addressable capabilities, but very often it will be the same advertisers we've seen before doing something in addition to a major campaign. So adding capability on is the big opportunity. So that was video one. If we just go on to the next summary slide, you'll see we've talked about the concepts. In the next video, we're going to talk about the players. We're going to delve into who's doing good things, who's got good case studies, prior to the final session, which will be the review section. The big mantra we want to take in through all of this is to join the debate. We would like everybody to challenge questions, so please feel free to think about what you've just seen in the video, send in questions, push back on us, challenge us, disagree with us if that's helpful. And we look forward to seeing you in the second video.